Some photos are not just photos. Some keep a piece of the people inside them. And if you look too long, they might look back. This is the story of a strange family in Montana, a family whose faces were so strange that people whispered they were not fully human. This is the Donnelly family, and no one knows where they went or what they became. Welcome to Behind the Genius, where we tell the darkest and strangest true stories from the past. If you like these old horrors, subscribe and sit close. Tonight's story is not safe to hear alone. The photo still exists. It is passed from person to person. Everyone who owns it suffers. Maybe the Donnellys never left. Maybe they're still waiting inside the picture. If you ever find it, burn it before they find you. The photo came into the man's life by accident. It was the summer of 1963 in Helena, Montana, and Thomas Green was wandering through an old estate sale. The sale was held in a big creaking house that had been closed for years. The air smelled of dust and dry wood, and sunlight came in through dirty windows, turning the dust into tiny floating stars. On a table in the corner, between a stack of brittle letters and a cracked porcelain vase, he saw it. A photograph. It was framed under thick glass, the kind you only see in very old pictures. The edges of the frame were dented, the wood darkened with age. Inside the frame, 4 people stood side by side, frozen forever. They were dressed like folks from the late 1800s. The man in a suit and bow tie, the women in high-neck dresses, the boy in a simple shirt. At first, Thomas didn't think much about it. He had always liked antiques, and the photo had that old Western charm. But then he looked closer. The faces, the father's eyes were sharp, but not in the way you expect. They seemed too alert, too focused, like the eyes of an animal about to spring. The mother's face was pale and thin, her mouth pressed into a line, but her gaze seemed almost too steady, as if she hadn't blinked when the camera clicked. The daughter, her smile was wrong. It showed too many teeth. They were large, uneven, jutting out at angles that didn't seem possible. Her eyes weren't looking at the camera at all. They were pointed slightly to the side, as though something just outside the frame had caught her attention. The boy's mouth was half open. You could see his teeth too, wide gaps, crooked lines, and a strange sharpness to them. He wasn't smiling, yet his lips were parted in a way that almost made it look like he was about to speak. Thomas felt a chill run through him. He told himself it was silly. It was just an old photo. People back then often looked strange in pictures because they had to stay still for a long time. But even as he thought it, something inside him whispered, "No, this is different." Still, it was only $1, and Thomas liked the frame. He bought it. That night, he brought it home and set it on his desk. His small house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock in the hallway. He sat down with a cup of coffee and glanced at the picture again. It was odd. He could swear the faces looked clearer than they had at the sale. The eyes seemed brighter, the skin less faded. He leaned closer, frowning. The daughter's teeth. He was sure they hadn't looked that sharp before. The boy's mouth, it seemed slightly more open. Thomas rubbed his eyes. He was tired. Maybe it was just his imagination. He put the photo in the drawer of his desk, closed it, and went to bed. At 2 a.m., Thomas woke up. At first, he thought it was the wind. The windows rattled slightly, and the night was cold. But then he heard it, a faint sound from his study. Click, click. It was a soft, quick noise, like someone tapping their teeth together. Thomas lay still, listening. It stopped. He told himself it was just the house settling. Old wood made noises like that. But when he closed his eyes again, the sound came back. Click, click, click. Slowly he got up. The hallway was dark, and the air seemed colder than before. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he walked toward the study. He opened the door. The room was empty. The desk drawer was closed, just as he had left it. Thomas hesitated, then walked to the desk and pulled the drawer open. The photograph lay inside, the faces staring up at him. The boy's mouth was wider now. Thomas stared, his heart thudding. The girl's eyes were no longer looking off to the side. They were looking directly at him. And behind the glass, the faintest trace of fog. From the inside, he slammed the drawer shut and stepped back. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, sunlight filled the study, warm and harmless. Thomas laughed at himself. It was just a picture. He had let his mind play tricks. But when he pulled the drawer open again, the glass over the photograph was completely clear. No fog at all. Yet something was wrong. The father's head was tilted slightly now, his sharp eyes locked straight on Thomas. Later that week, Thomas took the photo to a friend of his, an amateur historian named George Miller. George had a small shop filled with old books, maps, and photographs. He loved digging into Montana's past. When Thomas showed him the picture, George frowned. "That's strange," George said. "These folks? I think I've seen them before." He went to a shelf and pulled down a dusty book. It was a history of Montana settlements from the 1800s. Flipping through, he stopped at a page and tapped it. There they were, the same four faces. The caption read, "The Donnelly family, 1876, known for keeping to themselves, vanished without a trace." George looked up. They lived near the edge of town, way back in the frontier days. People said they were odd, not just in looks, but in behavior. No one really knew them. Then one winter, they just disappeared. House empty, food still on the table, never found. Thomas felt a shiver run through him. George squinted at the photo again. "It's odd, though. This picture, it's sharper than most from that time. Almost too clear." That night, Thomas decided he didn't want the photograph in his house anymore. He wrapped it in paper, put it in the garage, and locked the door. But at 3:08 a.m., he woke again. This time, there was no clicking sound, just silence. He lay still for a moment, relieved, until he noticed something. The air in his bedroom felt different. He could smell something faint, something old, like damp wood and dust that had been locked away for years. Slowly, he turned his head toward the corner of the room. In the shadows, something stood. Four figures, still watching. Their teeth caught the faint moonlight. Thomas woke the next morning in bed, unsure if he had dreamed it. He told himself he had, but when he went into the garage, the wrapping around the photo was gone. The frame sat bare on the shelf, the faces inside smiling slightly wider than before. And on the glass, just for a moment before it faded, he saw the shape of a handprint. From the inside, the next day, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about what George had said. The Donnelly family vanished in 1876. No one ever saw them again. It wasn't just the mystery that bothered him. It was the way their eyes looked in that photograph. Every time he pictured it, he felt like they were looking right into him. That evening, he went back to George's shop. The place smelled of old paper and tobacco. George was sitting behind the counter, reading. "I need to know more," Thomas said. George sighed, put his book down, and motioned him over. "Sit." He poured them both coffee, then pulled a box from under the counter. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, letters, and a few photographs. "These are from the Donnelly case," George said. "I've been collecting them for years." Not much was ever printed. People back then didn't talk about them. Thomas picked up the first clipping. The headline read, "Local family missing, no trace found." It was dated January 4th, 1877. The article said the Donnellys were a family of four: Patrick, the father, Mary, the mother, their daughter Abigail, and their young son Samuel. They lived far outside the town, in a wooden farmhouse near the forest. Neighbors described them as quiet but strange. Some said they never saw the children play outside. Others swore they heard odd noises from the Donnelly house at night, scratching, tapping, and sometimes a sound like many people whispering at once. The last time anyone saw them was during a trip to town in early December. They bought supplies, flour, salt, lamp oil, and then disappeared back to their land. By Christmas, no one had seen or heard from them. A search party was sent in late December. They found the house locked from the inside. When they broke in, the fire in the hearth was cold. The dining table was set for dinner. Bowls of stew sat untouched, frozen solid. Upstairs, every mirror had been covered with black cloth. The family was gone. No footprints in the snow. No wagon tracks. Nothing. "That's strange," Thomas murmured. George nodded. "It gets stranger." He handed Thomas another clipping, dated January 20th, 1877. This one was a letter from one of the search party members, published in the local paper. The man wrote that in the upstairs hallway, he had found deep scratch marks on the walls. Not like a person had made them, but something with claws. The marks went from the floor to the ceiling, as if whatever made them had been trying to climb or escape. He also wrote that when they uncovered one of the mirrors, it wasn't reflecting the room properly. Instead, it showed something dark, like a long hallway that wasn't there in the house at all. 2 days after writing that letter, the man fell ill and died. Thomas set the paper down. "And the photograph?" George rubbed his chin. "That's the thing, the photo you have. I think it's the same one that used to hang in their parlor. Some folks claimed it was taken just weeks before they vanished. But here's the problem. He leaned closer. That photo shouldn't exist anymore. The Donnelly house burned down in 1901. Everything inside was lost. If your photo came from that house, then how did it survive? That night, Thomas put the photo face down on his desk. He didn't put it in the drawer this time. He didn't put it in the garage. He told himself if it was in the open, it couldn't surprise him. Still, as he tried to sleep, the sound came again. Click, click, click. He turned on the lamp. The sound stopped, but the air felt heavy, cold. Something made him glance toward the door. It was open, though he was sure he had closed it before bed. When morning came, he found the photo upright again, leaning against the lamp. Someone or something had turned it over in the night. The faces looked sharper than ever. The next day, Thomas went back to George, bringing the photo with him. "I don't want it," Thomas said, setting it down hard on the counter. George didn't touch it right away. He stared at it, his brow furrowed. "It looks different," he muttered. "The faces," Thomas said quietly. "They move. Not much, just a little, but enough to notice." George swallowed. "I've heard stories like that. People said the Donnellys had something in their blood. Something not right. Some said they were cursed. Others said they were born wrong. There were even whispers about inbreeding. Or worse, that they weren't entirely human." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean, not human?" George shook his head. "I mean, there were tales about their eyes glowing in the dark, about teeth that could crack bone, about voices that could mimic anyone they heard. Most folks thought it was nonsense, until they vanished." That night, Thomas left the photo with George. But at 2 a.m., his phone rang. It was George. His voice was shaking. "Thomas, you need to come get this thing." "Now what? Why?" "I was sitting here looking at it, and then the glass fogged up. I wiped it, and their mouths were open. All of them. Even the father. Their teeth," his voice broke. "They looked like they were smiling at me. And then I heard the clicking. When Thomas got to the shop, the lights were on. The front door was open. George was gone. The photograph sat on the counter. The faces inside looked calm still, but their smiles were wider than before. And on the floor near the counter was a small trail of wet footprints, bare footprints, leading toward the back door, into the snow. Snow was falling hard when Thomas left George's shop that night. The photograph was wrapped in an old coat, tucked under his arm. He didn't want to touch the glass. He kept looking over his shoulder as he walked to his truck. The street was empty, but the snow muffled everything, making each step sound too loud. Inside the truck, his breath fogged the glass. The photo lay on the seat beside him. Even wrapped in the coat, it felt like it was watching. Thomas drove home, but the whole way, he kept thinking about those bare footprints in George's shop. Small feet, not adult, not child, something in between. And they had led out into the snow, barefoot. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the snow was falling in thick curtains. He shut off the truck and just sat there for a moment, staring at his porch. That's when he heard it. Click. Not in his head, not from the photo. From the porch, he turned his headlights toward the sound. The snow lit up in front of his truck, and there they were. 4 shapes, still. The father, the mother, the daughter, the boy. They were pale, their clothes ragged, their teeth catching the light. Their eyes were wide and unblinking. Thomas blinked, and they were gone. Only snow falling on an empty porch. He didn't sleep that night. He kept the lights on and the photo wrapped and locked in a cabinet. But every hour, he heard that soft clicking somewhere in the house. By morning, he had made up his mind. He was going to the Donnelly land. The next day, he drove 2 hours out of town to where the family's farm used to be. The road ended in a stretch of frozen dirt, and beyond it lay a field covered in snow, with dark trees on the far side. The house was still there. It leaned to one side, the wood dark and splintered. Most of the roof had caved in, but the front door stood closed, its paint long gone. The windows were black holes. Thomas stood in the snow for a long time, just looking. The air was still, but the trees whispered softly. He stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under his boots. He reached for the door and saw something carved into it. Inside, the air was thick and cold. The smell of damp wood and something sour hung heavy. Snow lay in patches on the floor where the roof was gone. The walls were gray with rot, but the dining table was still there, and it was set for 4. The bowls were empty now, but the chairs were pulled close, as if the family had only just gotten up. He walked slowly through the house. The living room was bare except for an old rocking chair, its seat split. Upstairs, the air felt colder. Every mirror was still covered with black cloth. In the hallway, the wallpaper was torn in long, vertical strips. Beneath it, deep scratches scored the wood. They started near the floor and climbed up toward the ceiling. Some ended in long, curling splinters, as if something with strong hands had ripped downward. He reached the last room on the left. The door was half open. Inside was a bed frame with no mattress, a broken lamp, and in the corner, a small child-sized shoe. The leather was cracked and stiff, but the laces were still tied. Next to it, pressed into the dusty floorboards, was the faint outline of a bare foot. Thomas backed away, his heart pounding. That's when he heard it. From the far end of the hallway, click, 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 slow. He turned. At the other end of the hallway stood the boy from the photograph. Pale skin, same crooked teeth, same wide eyes, but now the mouth was opening, wider and wider until it was far too large for his face. The clicking got faster. He didn't stop until he was outside, stumbling through the snow toward his truck. The air burned in his lungs, but he didn't dare look back. When he reached the driver's seat, he grabbed the door handle and froze. Were 4 bare footprints in the snow beside his truck. Leading to the passenger side, he opened the door slowly. The photograph was there on the seat. Thomas didn't remember driving home. He only remembered the snow rushing past his windshield, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and the photograph lying on the seat beside him, like it had waited for him. He left it in the truck when he got home. He didn't want it in the house. Not again. That night, he made tea, turned on every lamp, and sat in the kitchen with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. But it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the sound. From somewhere outside, faint and slow, came the same rhythm he'd heard at George's shop and in the hallway of the Donnelly house. Click, click, like fingernails on glass. He rose and went to the window. The snow in his yard lay untouched. The trees stood still in the moonlight. But there was something else. 4 shapes, standing at the edge of his yard, half hidden in the dark. The father, the mother, the daughter, the boy not moving, not breathing, just watching. Thomas blinked and they were gone. He closed the curtains, locked the door, and went upstairs. But the sound followed him, soft at first, then closer. He told himself it was in his head, the mind playing tricks, until the smell hit him. It was the same smell from the Donnelly house. Damp wood, sour, like something left too long in the dark. He went to the stairs and stopped halfway down. The front door was open. Snow blew in across the floor. The air was freezing, and there in the snow just inside the doorway, 4 sets of bare footprints. Thomas backed away, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He tried to tell himself he'd forgotten to lock the door. Maybe the wind, but no wind could leave footprints. He shut the door, locked it, and shoved a chair under the handle. The clicking started again. This time it was inside. It came from the hallway, then the kitchen, then the living room. Slurful, like they were learning the shape of the house. He sat on the stairs holding his breath. A new sound. A long, slow scrape like fingers dragging. Thomas couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. He stayed awake until dawn listening, and when the sun came up, the house was quiet. No footprints, no open doors, but in the kitchen, on the table, lay the photograph. Only this time, the background was different. It wasn't the Donnelly farm anymore. It was his house. He drove to George's shop the next morning, slamming the photograph down on the counter. "I don't want it. Take it back." George looked pale. "I can't. Once they're with you, they don't stop." "What are you talking about?" Thomas demanded. George didn't answer at first. He just stared at the picture. "They don't belong to this side anymore. That's why they can't stay in one place. They follow whoever sees them, and once they're close enough, they take you with them." Thomas laughed once, sharp and short. "That's just a story." George's eyes stayed on the photograph. "Look at the picture, Thomas. Look close." Thomas leaned in. The father's hand was resting on something in the frame. A wooden railing, not a railing from the farm, from Thomas's own porch. He drove home fast, trying not to think about it. He told himself he'd burn the photograph, smash the glass, throw the pieces into the river. But when he pulled into his driveway, he froze. The snow in the yard was full of prints, not just 4 sets this time. Small feet, big feet, twisted feet. They went all the way to his porch and stopped at his door. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The lights flickered when he turned them on, and the clicking started from upstairs, slow at first, then faster. Click, 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 click. Like they knew he was home. Thomas ran to the kitchen, grabbed a fire poker, and moved toward the stairs. Halfway up, he saw movement at the top, standing still, mouth open, teeth too sharp. Then the others appeared beside him, one by one. The mother's head tilted too far to the side, her neck bending with a soft crack. The father's hands hanging low, fingers dragging along the wall. The air grew thick, like breathing through wet cloth. Thomas gripped the poker so hard his hands hurt. "Get out," he said, his voice shaking. They didn't move. Then the boy took one slow step forward. The others followed. Thomas backed down the stairs, but they were faster than they looked. Their clicking steps echoed all around him now, not just in front but beside, behind, above. They were in the walls. He ran for the door, but when he yanked it open, snow blew in. And they were there, not in the yard anymore, standing right on his porch. And when they reached for him, their hands were freezing, but their grip was strong, too strong to break. Thomas doesn't remember much after that. Only flashes. The sound of wood splintering, and the photograph lying in the snow, face up. The Donnellys were smiling in it now, but there was someone else in the picture, standing with them. It was many years after the Donnellys had vanished, yet the land they left behind remained just as the search party had found it. Silent, bitterly cold in the winters, thick with the smell of damp earth in the summers, and wrapped in a stillness that even the wind seemed unwilling to disturb, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The house, though weather-beaten and sagging under the weight of time, still stood like a stubborn memory that refused to fade, its windows dark and hollow, each one like a watching eye that saw but never blinked. And though most townsfolk swore they would never set foot near it, there were always a few, young men trying to prove their courage, drifters with nowhere else to go, or curious travelers passing through, who would wander too close. And in every case, the story was much the same. They would enter laughing or whispering to each other, but they would leave pale, silent, and in a hurry, with none willing to speak about what they had seen inside. And so, by the winter of 1902, the Donnelly place had become more than just a piece of abandoned property. It had become a whispered dare, a shadow in the mind of every person in town, and for some a lure they could not resist. Thomas Bell, a widower in his late 50s, was one of those people. He had lived in the nearby town of Harrow's End his whole life, and he remembered, as a boy, seeing the search party come back from the Donnelly house all those decades ago, the men tight-lipped and unsettled, and though he never knew exactly what they had found, the silence around it had made it worse, because Thomas had always believed that a mystery unspoken was more dangerous than one told. He had no children, no close family left, and as the years wore on and his joints stiffened and his nights grew longer, he found his mind circling back to that old house in the clearing, wondering if the stories about it were just tales for children or if there was something real hidden inside. It was on one snow-heavy afternoon, the kind where the sky is white and the air seems to hum with the weight of approaching night, that Thomas decided to go. He did not tell anyone, not because he feared their judgment, but because he didn't want their worry or their warnings to pull him away from the thought that had been growing in him like a weed for years, that he needed to see for himself. He left just before the sun dipped, taking only a lantern, a walking stick, and a small flask of whiskey for warmth. The path was half covered in snow, and the forest that surrounded the Donnelly land was silent, except for the crunch of his boots and the occasional groan of an old tree shifting under the wind. As he neared the clearing, he noticed the snow was untouched, no tracks, no sign of animals, as though the land itself had been avoided not just by man, but by every living thing. The house rose before him like a shadow pulled up from the ground, its roof heavy with snow, the porch sagging, the door shut but not locked, and for a long while he simply stood there, lantern in hand, watching it as one might watch a sleeping animal, not sure if waking it would bring danger. Eventually, he stepped forward, the boards of the porch creaking under his weight, the sound echoing strangely in the still air. When he pushed open the door, it gave way with a long, slow groan, and the first thing he noticed was the cold, not the sharp bite of winter, but a deeper, older cold, the kind that feels as though it comes from the walls themselves. His lantern light fell across the main room, and there was the table, just as the old stories had said. 4 chairs, 4 place settings bowls filled with what had once been food but was now blackened and dry. cups frozen with a thin sheen of ice across their surfaces. The air smelled faintly of iron and something else, a sweet, rotting scent that made his stomach tighten. Stepped further in, the floor groaning under him, his breath rising in slow clouds, and it was then he noticed the mirrors, all covered, just as the search party had described, but the cloths were not dusty or brittle with age. They were clean, as though they had been placed there only days ago. His heart began to thump harder, and he told himself it was only the strangeness of being in such a place alone, yet some part of him, deep and unshakable, knew that he was not alone at all. Upstairs the sound came, faint at first, almost like the house settling, a slow, deliberate clicking, like fingernails tapping on glass. Thomas froze, his grip tightening on the walking stick, his lantern trembling slightly in his hand. The sound came again, closer now, and it was followed by a whisper, or perhaps it was just the wind through a crack in the wall, but it seemed to form a shape, a pattern, like words too faint to understand. He moved toward the stairs without meaning to, each step a battle between the instinct to turn and run and the deep, gnawing pull that had brought him here in the first place. The stairs groaned under his boots, and the air grew colder still, each breath like a small knife in his chest. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before him, narrow and dark, the doors on either side closed. The clicking had stopped, and the silence that replaced it was worse. He reached the first door on the left. With a hand that felt suddenly heavy, he pushed it open. The room was bare, the wallpaper peeling in long curls, the window cracked to the cold outside, but it was the far wall that caught his breath. It was covered, from floor to ceiling, in faces. Not photographs, not paintings, faces. Some were pale and lifeless, like plaster masks, but others looked alive, eyes wet and glistening, mouths curved into small, unnatural smiles. He stumbled back, hitting the doorframe, his lantern swinging wildly, shadows jumping across the walls. And it was then that he heard it again, the clicking, now directly behind him. He spun, but the hallway was empty. The sound came again, this time from inside the room, and when he turned back, several of the faces on the wall had changed. Their eyes were no longer staring straight ahead, but had turned slightly to look at him. Panic surged through him, and he backed toward the door, his breathing ragged, but the air felt thick, heavy, as though it clung to him. He managed to get into the hallway, slamming the door behind him, and he moved quickly now, not caring to see the other rooms. He reached the stairs, but before he could descend, the sound came once more, this time from below, from the main room. The slow, deliberate tap-tap-tap of teeth meeting teeth. Lantern light flickered against the walls as shadows moved in the space beneath him, shapes that did not match the furniture or the house itself. He took one step down, then another, his eyes fixed on the base of the stairs, and as he reached the bottom, he saw them. 4 figures, seated at the table, dressed in the same clothes as in the old photo. Their heads turned slowly in perfect unison toward him, and their smiles widened, revealing rows of 2 sharp teeth. He stumbled back, the lantern slipping from his grasp and shattering on the floor, the flame flaring and then dying, plunging the room into darkness. In that blackness, the clicking grew louder, surrounding him, moving closer, until he could feel cold breath on his face. And then, just as suddenly, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the deep, crushing silence of the old house. When the townsfolk found Thomas's walking stick on the porch the next morning, there was no sign of him anywhere. Not in the house, not in the clearing, not in the forest. But those who were brave enough to look inside said they noticed something new. A small, framed picture sitting on the mantel above the cold fireplace. It showed the Donnelly family seated at their table, their smiles wide and wrong. It was late autumn, the kind where the wind seemed to bite rather than brush against the skin. And the Donnelly land had once again gone silent, not just in the ordinary sense of country quiet, but in that heavy, unnatural silence where even the trees seemed to lean away from the house as though trying to escape it. People in town said it happened every year around this time, but this year something felt different, heavier, and it began with old Thomas Miller, the last surviving man in Hyen who had ever set foot inside the Donnelly house and lived to tell it. Though tell it was never the right word, because most of what he spoke came in half sentences, long pauses, and eyes that wandered to places no one else could see. Thomas had been only a boy of 12, the winter the family vanished in 1876, a boy who followed his father and 3 other men into the house when the chimney stopped smoking and the animals wandered loose. And even now, over 80 years later, when the snow had settled like a thick shroud over the empty field, he swore he could still smell the air from that day. Cold, yes, but layered with a sweet rotting scent like fruit left too long in a closed room, a scent that clung to their clothes long after they'd left. He remembered stepping over the threshold and feeling something give under his boot. Not quite wood, not quite carpet. And when he looked down, it was a length of thin, yellowed string stretched across the doorway at ankle height, snapping softly as he passed, though none of the other men seemed to notice it. And from that moment forward he felt, no, he knew, the house was aware of them, aware in the same way a living thing notices something crawling on its skin. The kitchen had been the first room they entered, and he saw the table set for 4, each place with a deep bowl of stew frozen into a single pale mass, the surface cracked where spoons had been half lifted, the spoons still resting there as though the hands that had held them had simply evaporated. Every mirror they passed was covered with black cloth nailed down at the corners. And even as a boy, Thomas had the urge to lift one, not out of curiosity, but because he felt something behind the cloth, something pressing against it as if wanting to push through. But his father caught his hand before he could touch it and hissed, "Don't," in a tone he had never heard from him before. Half warning, half prayer. Upstairs, the air was warmer, almost damp, and the wallpaper in the hallway was peeled in long strips that curled toward the floor, as though something had clawed at it for hours, desperate to escape or to burrow deeper. And Thomas noticed that the claw marks didn't just stop at the walls. They trailed across the ceiling too, high and thin, impossible for human hands to have reached. When they opened the first bedroom door, they found the bed neatly made, but the pillow was sunken in the exact shape of a head, as if someone had been lying there only moments before, and beside it, on the small night table, sat a photograph of the family. Father, mother, daughter, son, all standing in front of the same house they were in now. Only in the photo their eyes were so sharp and dark that Thomas felt, if he looked long enough, they might start to move. As they moved down the hall toward the master bedroom, the sound began, faint at first, like rain hitting tin, then clearer, a dry, steady clicking that echoed through the walls, and Thomas thought it sounded like teeth tapping together, the same sound he had heard men in town whisper about years later when drink loosened their tongues. The men exchanged looks, and one of them, a big man named Harris, muttered that it was just a mouse in the walls, but his voice broke on the word mouse, and they all knew he didn't believe it. When they opened the last door, the clicking stopped, and for a long moment they simply stood there, not daring to step inside. The room was almost bare, except for a single chair in the middle, facing the window, and on the seat of the chair was a pile of things wrapped in cloth, and when one of the men knelt and pulled the cloth back, Thomas saw not clothes or blankets but faces. Flat, paper-thin faces, dozens of them, like photographs without bodies, each one with eyes that were too bright, too focused, all staring up at him. Harris swore and backed away, and in that moment the wind outside picked up, rattling the glass. But the sound was wrong. It didn't come from the window. It came from behind the walls, a long, low hum that rose in pitch until Thomas thought his skull might crack. And then all at once the men were moving, not speaking, not looking back, just moving, out of the room, down the stairs, across the cold kitchen, and out the front door, and Thomas could swear the door closed behind them on its own. They never spoke of what they'd found, not in detail, and in the days that followed, each man seemed to fade a little. Harris stopped showing up at the mill. Thomas's father began waking at night screaming about the faces, and one by one the others left town, or were found dead in strange, quiet ways. Years passed, the house rotted, and the snow and grass swallowed the fence, but still people saw things. Shapes in the upstairs window when the moon was full, prints in the frost that led up to the porch but never away, a flicker of teeth in the dark like the glint of something wet. When Thomas grew old, he moved to a small cabin miles away. But even there, in the dead of night, he sometimes woke to the clicking sound, faint at first, then closer, as if something had found the path back to him, and he often wondered if the Donnellys had ever really left that house at all, or if the house itself was just wearing their shape, waiting for someone else to cross the threshold and sit at the table where the bowls of stew would never melt, where the chairs would never be empty, and where the clicking in the walls would never ever stop.